You remember last week that we heard Jesus ask the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And I invited you to ponder over this question, but who do you say that I am? But then immediately after that, Jesus then says that he is going to have to die. He says he's going to be handed over and he's going to be suffered and spat upon, and then he's going to be crucified and die, but on the third day be raised again. And how did the disciples react? Well, they reacted completely in the wrong way. Peter says, "It shall not be such," and he rebukes Jesus, and then Jesus rebukes him, and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." So this today is the second time that Jesus says what's going to happen to him. He says, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him, and 3 days after his death, the Son of Man will rise." So he's preparing his disciples. He's preparing his disciples for what's going to be happening, for what's the purpose of his mission, of dying for the sake of our freedom, to set us free from our sins, and rising again to break the power of death. And again, a completely wrong response. Of course, they didn't say anything to him. They were afraid to question him, because if they said, "What do you mean by that?" they might come to know that he actually means what he says he means. But then, what were you arguing about on the way? About who's going to be the greatest? Did you not just hear that the Son of Man is going to die, and you're wondering about who's the greatest? There's a third time, which will come up. I don't know if we're going to hear it in the lectionary. It's not next week, but where, again, they have the completely wrong response. But Jesus is showing us this is what has to happen. And Mark is putting this forward, not so that we can look and say, "What dolts those disciples were. I can't believe how silly they were to think of doing that." But rather, St. Mark is putting this forward to show us we don't understand the crucifixion any better than they did. That we really need to be pondering and saying, "God, why did you have to die? Why did you have to die?" In case you didn't know what's happening in town, it's Old Home Day. Did you have trouble finding a parking space? I know some people did. So I was walking downtown today and going around to the different places. On my way, I passed by the VFW, and this guy starts talking to me. And I was like, "Oh, is he part of the VFW?" He starts talking to me, hands me some stuff about freedom and everything. And then as the more I'm talking, I'm finding out, oh, this is the new Baptist minister for the church over here. And so we had a nice conversation, and then he started asking me about the differences in our theology, which you don't need to hear all the details of that. But one of the things he did ask me is, as he's starting to talk about a little bit about fire and brimstone, he says, "Do you preach like that?" You know how much. I do that occasionally, periodically. I do the fire and brimstone homilies, but I always try to bring the good news into it. But as I was pondering over this, over what this means, remembering whether it's one perspective or another, we always have to remember that Jesus went to the cross for a reason. And if we don't recognize that our sin really wounds the heart of God, kills our relationship with Him, if we don't realize that our sin has eternal consequences, this means absolutely nothing. Now, we don't necessarily need to do the fire and brimstone homily in order to get the fact that. But we do need to come to a realization, unlike what the world says, I'm not okay and you're not okay. If I'm okay and you're okay, there's no need for this. This was a complete waste of God's time to go to the cross. Why did Jesus have to go to the cross? He's showing us, if nothing else, what the price of forgiveness of sins looks like. This is what sin does to God, but He chose it because He loves us. He'd do it again. He loves you that much. And don't get down on yourself and start feeling, oh, I'm terrible, I did all this. No, that's not the point of all this, but rather to look and say, do you see how much He loves us? That He would do that for me, for you. You are worth every drop of His blood. But Jesus says, in order to claim this, in order to grab a hold of this, in order to be a part of this mercy that He is pouring into us, sometimes we have to surrender certain things in our lives. Anyone who wishes to be first shall be the last of all and the servant of all. Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me. He's saying, do you not see that it's the least, the smallest, the ones who can give nothing back to society, the ones who are, as it were, useless to society, that Jesus identifies with? At the end of the Gospel of Matthew, we hear this as He says, I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. That Jesus goes to the lowest place. Remember a few weeks ago when we had that second reading about marriage, where St. Paul in the letter to the Ephesians says, subordinate yourselves to one another out of love for Christ. He then says, wives, to your husbands, and husbands, die to yourself out of love for your wives. He's saying, this is what it means. If you try to be first, you don't get it. If you want to be first, you have to go and be the last of all and the servant of all. So sometimes we have to surrender our own seeking of control and power and the struggles that we have and serve. St. John Paul II was always someone that I always looked up to growing up. Not the least, he was Pope, so that was something to look up to. But, when I was growing up, Marvel, can you believe this? Marvel Comics put out a comic book about the life of St. John Paul II. Superhero? I think maybe. And I'm serious. It came out not long after the Pope was shot in 1981, because they actually had that at the end of the comic book about how he was shot, how he lived, how he forgave his assailant. But so I grew up reading a comic book about St. John Paul II. Pretty neat, huh? And it would be nice if they actually put out another one, see if Marvel could do that. Put out another one actually like telling his whole life, not just up to the end of his life. But it was talking about his whole life. And one of the things that really struck me is, as they were recovering at the end of World War II, and he was in the seminary with the other seminarians, and they went back into the building where they were going to be having their seminary. Well, there were all sorts of problems with the building, including the fact that the plumbing had backed up all over the floor, everywhere in this building. And so what did then Karol Wojtyła do? Well, he said, I'll clean it up. He says it's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it. I'm sure that's not exactly what he said in the Polish, but that's what Marvel put into his mouth. And having studied his life a little bit more, he did do that. He went and he took that lowest job. And because of that, we look up to him. Because he took the lowest place. And God is saying to us, I've taken the lowest place. I've made myself so powerless, I can't even move my hands from the cross. Do you see how much I love you? May we open our hearts to the grace of God moving in our midst, asking us also to go to that lowest place. And as last week I invited you to ponder that question, who do you say that I am? I invite you this week to ponder this question: why did Jesus have to go to the cross? Why did Jesus have to go to the cross? It's a question you could pray over for the rest of your life. Allow it to permeate. Allow it to transform. Allow it to draw you deeper into the mystery of God's mercy and love.